Hi, everyone. Welcome finally to the lecture for Chapter 6. So I want to make a couple of announcements. First of all, I'm sorry about last week. You might notice me pausing the lecture. You can see down here when I do it, and then starting back up. I still have quite the cough, and so lecturing is still not my fine point right now, and I'd like to spare you that. Also, there's been some confusion about how the modules work, and some people joined the class late, and I sent out an announcement saying if you joined the class late to notify me, and some people did and some people didn't. Every time you complete a module, with the exception of the previous module, because that one was a little messed up, you have to complete the quiz in order to view the next module. The next module will not go live unless you at least make an attempt on the quiz. So some of you had completed parts of it but had not completed the quiz, and then therefore you're saying I can only see till module 2, and now we're on module 5 this week. So basically you need to have caught up soon. I reopened all of the quizzes so everybody could get through there, but um, you know, you need to have gotten through these modules by this week because otherwise you're very behind. Some people didn't notify me until recently that they could not see module 3 yet, which went live 2 weeks ago. So make sure you're caught up. I'll send out an announcement as well, making sure you are on Module 5 this week. And Module 5, I'm going to give you a truncated version of the lecture for Chapter 6 and 8. You're going to watch a short video about wolves and Yellowstone. You're going to answer a discussion question about that. And then you are going to take a quiz, which is going to include questions from both Chapter 6 and Chapter 8, since I didn't quiz you on them last week. The quiz, you're going to get longer for it this week because it's kind of making up for 2 weeks worth of quiz. And that's a lot of material, Chapter 6 and Chapter 8. You should focus on what I am talking about in the lectures. That is what you are mainly going to be quizzed on with these chapters. So, read the chapters, but don't worry about some obscure detail from the chapter being what you are quizzed on. So, Chapter 6, which is all about communities and ecosystems. So, in Chapter 6, we're mainly talking about interconnections, right? How throughout systems, how through these landscapes are different living and sometimes non-living things connected. And these connections are often complex and poorly understood sometimes. So, which you will see in that video that you watch about Yellowstone. But, often when one thing or one species in the ecosystem suffers, there are all kinds of cascading effects that we don't necessarily understand. So a lot of components are dependent upon others. Your book gives the example of grasses are eaten by herbivores, and the grasses are kept at a certain kind of capacity based upon those herbivores. Those herbivores then produce a lot of manure, which are then used by dung beetles and other insectivores, which are then related to the grasses. So what I want you to take away from this is the interconnectivity of nature and these systems. And then you can have different types of competition within these systems. You can have intraspecific competition, which is when members of the same species compete. So you have multiple zebras in an area, and those multiple zebras are competing for the same resources. And then you can have interspecific competition, which is when different species that should say compete, excuse me, not complete, for resources. So example, you have zebras and wildebeest, which are possibly eating the same vegetation and the same landscape, and so they are competing for that with each other. And so when you have competition for shared resources, basically what we are looking at, and this is what your writing exercise was about last week, is a an organism's ecological niche. So that is the role an organism fills within its habitat, right? So we think about that dung beetle has a very specific role in that habitat that we just talked about. They also have their fundamental niche, which is the complete range of areas in which an organism could exist, right? So if you have, a wildebeest that is living in a particular ecosystem, but could range out from where it is living into other areas, that is the complete range of areas which that organism could exist. Those niches are often truncated by human development and human actions. And then you have the realized niche, which is the range in which an organism actually exists due to competition. Maybe that wildebeest is not going to a particular area on the west side of the river because there are mostly zebras there. And so, again, the ecological niche, that's the role it's filling, right? Is it an herbivore? Is it a decomposer? The fundamental niche, which is the complete range of areas in which the organism could exist, and then the realized niche, which is where it's actually existing due to that competition. So, So when we think about ecological niches, right, we think that there is a division of those resources based upon the potential competitors that are in an area. And so I'm going to show two illustrations in a second, one of warblers and evergreen trees and another of plant root structure in prairies. But basically you have different organisms competing for resources. And they are going to find small little differences in order to utilize those resources. So in the example of the warblers, right, we have several different types of warblers that are all related species, but they're different species, and they've all been they have all evolved in a very specific way in order to take advantage of a different part of the tree canopy. And so you will often see this in nature where you have like very specific evolution in order to take advantage of specific parts of an ecosystem. So when we look at in the prairie, when we look at different plants in a prairie, right, all of these guys above the surface look like they're in the same area, but they all have very different root systems. Some are going much deeper than others, some are grabbing shallower resources. So they are sharing those, they're competing for and sharing those resources, and they've evolved in order to do that. We're also going to talk about herbivory, predation, and parasitism. So herbivores are adapted to feed on plant material. They have specialized digestive systems in order to do so. They have an ability to detoxify certain plant chemicals. Right? We humans, we can eat lots of plants, but there's a lot of plant nutrition that we can't effectively access as well as herbivores can. And then you have certain herbivores who have co-evolved with plant species in order to both survive. So the milkweed and the monarch butterfly, the milkweed needs the monarch butterfly to be its pollinator. The monarch butterfly feeds off the milkweed, and they have this nice co-evolution, this tit-for-tat evolution of prey and species that consumes it. Predators are organisms that capture, kill, and consume prey. Pretty straightforward. Many predators hunt various species, not just one. Will have kind of a varied diet of multiple things. They will often switch their prey dependent upon the abundance of a variety of prey species. And prey responds by adapting its defenses, whether it adapts some type of protection or some type of camouflage. So we can think of the example of the stick bug, right? The stick bug has evolved to look an awful lot like a stick, right, to protect itself from predation. It is harder to find. So organisms that have developed some type of protection, whether it's camouflage um, um, or some other type of protection in order to kind of thwart being eaten. So there's this constant competition back and forth. And then lastly, parasites. Parasites are dependent on a living host for nourishment. They usually do not kill the host. This is not always true, but they usually do not kill the host because they need the host to survive. They can be external parasites or internal parasites. This is parasites attacking a forest here. But they need that living host in order to survive. And then parasites may also be spread by vectors, which means vectors are things that carry parasites but remain relatively unaffected. So, something could carry a parasite along, drop it off at another place, it attacks that thing, but the thing that carried it there remains unaffected. We also want to talk about the flow of energy in ecological communities. All of our energy is coming in from the sun, all of it. And it travels up a food chain. We're going to talk about food webs, which is a little bit more accurate of how to think about things. But energy must flow through these ecological communities. The energy from the sun makes the plants grow. Plants are eaten by things. Things are eaten things that eat the plants, right? And so on and so forth. But energy flow is the transfer and transformation of energy. When we eat a cheeseburger, if you are so inclined to, we are eating an animal that ate grass, ideally, and that grass grew from energy from the sun. Organisms are classified by their trophic level, and that's based upon their food source. So we have, and we'll go through these, we have primary producers, which are at the first trophic level. Primary consumers, those are the ones who are eating the primary producers, secondary consumers, and then tertiary consumers. And then lastly, we have decomposers, which are organisms that feed on non-living organic matter, so things that are breaking everything down. But basically, you are losing a certain amount of energy along the way. So the snail is using a certain amount of the energy that was taken in from the grass in order to move around and be a snail. Then the snail is eaten by the bird. The bird is using some of that energy to move around and be a bird, and so on and so forth. So we have food chains and slash food webs. This is a depiction of feeding relationships among organisms, and I'll show you a picture or an illustration of that in a second. But again, primary producers are that first trophic level. They transform the energy from sun or chemicals. Then we have primary consumers, which are the second trophic level. Those are our herbivores who are eating those primary producers. Then we have secondary consumers, our third trophic level. Those are our carnivores. And then we have tertiary consumers. That's our fourth trophic level. Those are our top carnivores. Those are carnivores that are generally eating other carnivores. And then we have decomposers, like I said. They feed on non-living organic matter, feces, dead organisms. These are the things that break down and recycle waste. When we think about trophic level efficiency, again, much of the energy consumed is used by that organism, and so only about 10% available to the next trophic level, right? As that snail eats that grass, it uses a bunch of that energy to be a snail, and so only about 10% of the energy that was originally consumed is available to that bird. So a lot of people who advocate for veganism or to be a vegetarian say it is much more energy efficient because you are directly eating those primary producers. So here's an illustration of a food web where you have seagrasses and marine algae that are our primary producers and phytoplankton that are then eaten by these primary consumers. And then these primary consumers are eaten by these secondary consumers, right? Crabs, blue crabs are eating mussels, and so on and so forth to our tertiary consumers. Sometimes then we have our decomposers down here. Sometimes the decomposers are being eaten by other things, right? We're eating more than one thing. So a food web is a little bit more descriptive of what's happening than a food chain, which only implies one single connection, right? We have lots of ways in which these guys are connected. And you can imagine that if one of these guys is removed from here, you can have a pretty big effect on the ecosystem. The only thing that I'm going to say here about the carbon cycle, your book talks about the carbon cycle. We are going to talk about it a lot more when we get to climate change. So I'm going to just briefly touch on it here. But basically, this is all kind of a transfer of carbon. Right, so organic matter is carbon. We are eating the organic matter. Things are eating the organic matter. We burn carbon. There is a carbon cycle by which carbon dioxide, excuse me, not carbon dioxide, sometimes carbon dioxide, but carbon is cycled through. So we're going to talk about in climate change this more in depth and how we are altering this carbon cycle. But these ecological systems are heavily related to the carbon cycle. So now we're going to move on to chapter 8, which is biodiversity conservation. So first of all, what is biodiversity? Biodiversity is the variety of life in all forms, combinations, and organization. So basically, the variety of life on the planet. This includes a few different types of biodiversity. This includes landscape biodiversity, community biodiversity, and population biodiversity. And I'll talk about what I mean by these three. We're also going to talk about how we categorize, not just categorize, but how we calculate biodiversity. So landscape biodiversity is the variety and abundance of species from a place to place. And this pattern is driven by two primary factors. The first is gradual change in environmental factors, whether that's temperature, growing seasons, water availability, some other things. You think about if you go up in elevation slightly, your landscape is going to change due to a change in temperature and often a change in precipitation. Also, the history of local disturbance, if you live in a fire ecosystem or if you have specific flood cycles, those ecosystems are going to change based upon those disturbances. Then you have community biodiversity, which is the number of species, their relative abundance, and their arrangement in space. So we talk about that in a couple different ways. We talk about species richness, which is just a count of the total number of species in an area, right? If there's 5 species of butterfly in the area, that's our species richness. And also our species evenness, so our relative abundance of species in a community. So when we look at, I'll show you an illustration about what I'm talking about in a second, but then we can also think about the structural complexity, which is the 3-dimensional distribution of species and their biological features. So when we have these kind of two illustrations of butterfly communities, right? The one on the left has the same number of species on the one on the right, right? So they both have, I think, 4 species here. But the one on the left is a lot less uneven than the one on the right. The one on the right, there's kind of a relative, almost equal number. There actually is an equal number. There's 3 of each, right? So these are, again, talking about our species evenness, talking about abundance versus just how many our species richness. And this complexity causes diversity. So if we think about the diversity of such as a rainforest on the left, lots of diversity, as opposed to a grassland like this on the right, especially if it's an invasive grassland, you're going to talk about a lot less diversity. Same thing with coral reefs. Coral reefs are going to support a lot more different types of species than kind of a sandbar is. We can also think about genetic diversity, not just landscape diversity or things like species richness and evenness, but also kind of how diverse that genetics material is in that population. So we're talking about genetic variation among individuals. Now, the picture on the right is obviously dogs, as I'm sure we're all familiar with. These dogs have been bred for certain characteristics, but these dogs are um, all the same species, right? There's a lot of genetic variation in this picture because we have kind of dogs of all different breeds and different characteristics, but they're all the same species. They could mate together. So this is, but if you have, right, ideally you want outbreeding. So you want mating with non-related individuals, and that maximizes diversity as opposed to inbreeding, where you have mating between closely related individuals. And this increases the chance of genetic disease or reproductive failure. So when you talk about purebred dogs, while they are beautiful, they're often less healthy than dogs that are considered mutts, because dogs that are considered mutts or mixed breeds have more genetic diversity in them than these kind of pure breed ones that have been bred over and over and over again with each other in order to kind of produce these very specific characteristics. That genetic pool is only so large. So often you will have breeds of dog that kind of have these kind of chronic health problems that are related to this kind of, being bred for a specific characteristic without a lot of genetic biodiversity. So this is a kind of man-made example, but if you have a very small isolated population that is just breeding with each other and does not have a chance to breed with other populations, you have a higher chance of genetic disease and or reproductive failure. So why does biodiversity matter, and why are we talking about it in the first place? You're going to recognize our ecosystem services picture there from a couple of chapters ago. But biodiversity helps ecosystems respond to disturbance or change. And it provides humans with many ecosystem services. So generally speaking, the more diverse an ecosystem is, the more it can respond to a disturbance or change. So again, to use a man-made example, if you have a farm and all you are growing on this farm is a single crop, and something comes in, some type of disease comes in that is specifically evolved to wipe out that crop, and it comes in, then you have no crops, right? It has knocked out your crops altogether. As opposed to if you have a farm with a variety of crops, if that thing comes in, well, I'm going to lose the corn, but I'm going to have a lot of other things that's going to help that farm stay strong. Same thing happens with nature. And very often, this biodiversity contributes to and helps many of these ecosystem services, which I'm not going to talk about extensively because we talked about them before, but we need these ecosystem services and they are related to biodiversity. So again, ecosystem stability, biodiversity enables ecosystems to resist and recover from changes and or disturbances such as drought pictured on the right. Diverse ecosystems have many species with varying tolerances and enhances the ecosystem's ability to survive disturbance or change. So again, this drought comes into this forest. Some species may die off or barely survive, but lots of other ones, they have different tolerances to drought. And so this ecosystem, this forest is going to survive as a whole because there was diversity in the system. Also, we want to think about economic value, which is something that it might not be totally intuitive, but biodiversity provides essential goods and services. Biodiversity, we have really kind of truncated the list of foods that we consume, but we can actually consume many more foods than we do. So diversity of food, fiber, things like ecotourism, medicine, lots of medicines are plant-based, and biotechnology. So lots of economic value as well, if you want to think about it in strictly kind of capitalist terms and why we should really be concerned about biodiversity, it has a pretty significant economic value. We can think of, here's an example of several medicines that have been derived from plants and have, treat all kinds of things from heart failure to childhood leukemia and depression and malaria, Parkinson's disease. Aspirin um, uh, was originally derived from a willow, right? Lots of medicines um, derived from pretty specific plants. When we look at global patterns of biodiversity, the Earth supports 7 to 15 million species of eukaryotes, which are basically celled organisms as opposed to bacteria. So I'm not talking about bacteria here, but everything else that you would generally think of as an organism, right? Only 10 to 20% have been described. And terrestrially, over 80% of animals, um, most are insects. And in marine, almost 50% of those are algae, right? So, which is kind of a little overwhelming to think that 80% of the species that of that 80%, most of them are insects. There are an incredible amount of insects, incredible amount of biomass that is insects on the planet. But we've only described about 10 to 20% rather than say discovered. But those are like named species that have been described. There are so many more that have not been, that we don't necessarily understand their ecological value, their economic value, their potential to cure disease, or how they are contributing to providing ecosystem services for people. We also have biodiversity hotspots, which is where you have a large number of endemic species. Endemic species are species that are only occurring in that place, right? They're only occurring there and really nowhere else. And human actions often threaten those habitats, right? So we want to make sure that we protect those biodiversity hotspots. Globally speaking, there is, the band of biodiversity hotspots, but as you can imagine, the colder the place, the less kind of biodiversity you're going to get, the less species variety. But we live in something called the California Floristic Province, which is a biodiversity hotspot. We have lots of species that live here and nowhere else in the world. I think San Diego County is the most biodiverse county in the continental United States, right? So things like the Torrey Pine only live here. So if you've gone to Torrey Pine Regional Park, right, Torrey Pines only in Southern California. And the Torrey Pines in that area, I think they exist there and on one, if I'm correct, they exist there and on one of the Channel Islands. But the ones there are so interbred that they're almost genetically identical. So not a very healthy population. Those Torrey Pines could be potentially very easily wiped out. Threats to biodiversity, we have human activities, again, increasing extinction rates. So when we think about, clearing land for primarily usually to graze cattle or grow food, we have habitat loss and destruction. We also have overharvesting, both of things like timber, but also especially fisheries. We'll talk about fisheries more later in the semester, but the majority of things that we eat that come out of the ocean are overfished. We also have non-native invasive species, so things that we have brought in from other places that are threatening biodiversity. So things like the Asian carp, which is making its way through US waterways, which is originally from Asia and is out competing everything else in that ecosystem because there's nothing there to check it. So reducing the biodiversity and taking over the region. Pollution, obviously, if we pollute our ecosystems, we are going to kill off a lot of the biodiversity. Altering patterns of disturbance, so altering things like flood and fire cycles. Climate change, which changes in temperature and weather patterns and precipitation, which again, we'll talk about a lot more when we get to climate change later in the semester. Also, we want to think about not just habitat loss, but habitat fragmentation. And so I'm going to talk about things uh, such as corridors versus islands. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. And so let's say we build some houses over here and we save this little protected area over here that we're not going to develop. And then we build some buildings over here and we have a little protected area over here, some houses and a little protected area, right? More houses and little protected areas. And so now what we have is a bunch of little islands of wildlife that can't necessarily species can't easily move in between those areas in order to mate or hunt or feed or do a wide variety of other things. And so as you isolate those populations, you're reducing the overall biodiversity, but also potentially the genetic biodiversity. And so what a lot of conservation does is work on creating corridors. So we want to create kind of these protected areas, but that are connected by habitat corridors so that these species can move throughout this landscape more easily and therefore lead to more ecosystem biodiversity. And sometimes we have to make choices in development so we can move things over and get a larger corridor, right? We want to consider this when we are planning in the first place, right? We don't want to just have the bare minimum in these corridors. We want to make sure that species can actually move through them. We protect biodiversity in a couple of different ways, in several different ways, and we'll talk about this as the semester goes on. We'll talk about specific policies. Your chapter talks about specific policies. I'm not going to get into them here, but one of the major ways that we do that is by creating protected areas. So protected areas is really varied in definition. So a protected area can be something where no take is allowed. Basically, it's totally protected, right? There's no logging, there is no hunting, there is no, if it's a marine protected area, no fishing. Sometimes it's protected only for certain things and not other things. So some marine protected areas allow fishing of certain types and not fishing of others. Some marine protected areas only protect against ground disturbance and not against fishing. So it's really varied. Generally speaking, overall protection rate globally is much lower than what it actually needs to be effective in protecting biodiversity on a global scale. We also have a problem with something that we call paper parks, which means that I could label anything that I want on a map as a protected area. And it often looks good, and it would say, okay, well, we protected 20% of this habitat. But if nothing is actually going to fund that protection, if nobody knows that it's protected, if it doesn't have some type of enforcement, whether that is actual kind of law enforcement, making sure, or a community that's really invested in not letting people use that resource, it's essentially a paper park. It's a park on paper, but it's not necessarily a park in any other means, right? People have to know about it. It has to be adequately protected. It has to be adequately enforced and funded. And one of the other ways that we protect biodiversity, and this is the last thing that I'm going to talk about in this lecture, is species management, right? So we try to manage and help specific species. So San Diego, we love our pandas, right? Part of the program at the San Diego Zoo is we get pandas from China. We breed pandas, and those pandas eventually go back to China, right? They are part of a breeding program. So often you think about species that are threatened, where you may have some in captivity that can be successfully bred, and then you can try to reintroduce some of those into the wild. The video you're going to watch is about wolves, right, being returned to Yellowstone after them being gone out of Yellowstone for quite a while and kind of the changes that occurred there. So, reintroducing species to certain areas, or trying to boost populations in order to create a greater ecosystem and biodiversity strength in that area. So that is the end of the lecture for chapters 6 and 8. You're going to watch that video. You're going to do writing exercise 4, I think it is at this point, and then you're going to move on to your quiz.